On a cold evening in early December in the peaceful suburbs of Oregon, USA, a quiet, small house suddenly became the scene of a horrifying crime. 4 members of a family were brutally murdered. The police were faced with a complex puzzle, requiring a long and challenging investigation. The horrifying crime scene. The evening was cold, the pale December moon casting an icy glow on the quiet suburban streets of Oregon. Everything about the neighborhood seemed picturesque, a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. That was until a panicked call from the Carter family's neighbor shattered the stillness, prompting a swift response from the local police. When law enforcement officers arrived, they were instantly struck by the eerie silence. The quaint single-story home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its white picket fence and classic porch swing now imbued with a haunting undertone. As they approached the front door, a faint glimmer of light peeked through one of the curtained windows, but knocking yielded no answer. Sensing something was gravely wrong, an officer pushed the door open, and what lay beyond would haunt their memories forever. The living room, once a space filled with warmth and laughter, was now a scene of utter devastation. Furniture was overturned. The coffee table lay splintered as if a violent struggle had erupted. Behind the sofa, a crimson stain seeped into the faded carpet, a grotesque reminder that blood had been spilled here. The silence wasn't the quiet of peace but the deafening void left in the wake of unimaginable violence. As officers moved deeper into the house, the horror only intensified. In the modest family kitchen, the refrigerator door was ajar, its contents spilling out haphazardly across the floor. A glance towards the counter revealed shattered dinner plates alongside a cooling half-eaten meal, perhaps meant to be the family's last supper together, interrupted by uninvited terror. The cabinets hung half open as though someone had rummaged through them in haste, desperate to find something valuable or sinister. But it was in the bedrooms where the true gravity of the crime unfolded. The master bedroom displayed the grim, final moments of Mr. and Mrs. Carter. William Carter, a man known to his community as generous and soft-spoken, lay lifeless at the foot of the bed, the red of his blood staining the beige rug in gruesome patterns. His wife, Eleanor, was sprawled across the mattress, her hands still bound with a strip of bedsheet, silent witnesses to the horrifying struggle she had put up to protect her family. The walls bore streaks of blood, showing signs of resistance and chaos. In the adjacent hallway, a trail of small blood droplets led to a child's bedroom. It was here that officers discovered the bodies of Emily Carter, the couple's 14-year-old daughter, and little Noah, just 7 years old. Emily's room bore the bright, innocent touches of a teenager, posters on the wall, fairy lights framing the bed, twisted by the unspeakable brutality that had unfolded there. Noah lay curled up near the doorway, his small hands clutching a stuffed bear now soaked in blood. The sight tore at even the most hardened officers' hearts. The scene felt meticulously chaotic, a paradox that puzzled investigators. Drawers had been forcefully opened, yet some valuables still remained untouched. That suggested the intruders weren't motivated purely by theft. The family's landline phone had its cord cleanly severed, cutting off any potential cries for help. A clinical, deliberate move by the assailants. Outside the back door, faint, muddy footprints disappeared into the night, hinting at a careful yet urgent retreat. It felt like stepping into a nightmare, Detective Laura Harrison later recounted during a briefing. It wasn't just the violence, it was the way the house felt. Violated. This was a home filled with love, and someone turned it into a slaughterhouse. As forensic teams swarmed the scene, the neighborhood began to gather outside, their murmurs of fear growing louder by the minute. This wasn't something that happened here, in their peaceful, close-knit community. And yet, here it was, a grotesque stain on their idyllic world. Reporters arrived in droves, their flashing cameras illuminating the sorrow etched on the faces of neighbors who whispered, "How could this ever happen here?" For the investigators, the crime scene held no immediate answers, only haunting questions. What kind of person or people could commit such a heinous act? Why this family? The pieces did not fit together, and yet the truth was somewhere within the chaos left behind. The Carter home, once a safe haven for a small and loving family, now stood as a chilling monument to a crime that would shake the town and the nation to its very core. The initial investigation. When the scene was first cleared and the bodies tragically confirmed, the clock began ticking for the investigators. For crimes of this magnitude, the first 48 hours were critical. But nothing about this investigation was straightforward. The serene demeanor of the Carter family's suburban neighborhood only deepened the sense of shock and urgency. The detectives understood that while the crime scene froze a moment of horror, it also contained the whispers, clues, and breadcrumbs they needed to untangle the nightmare. Detective Laura Harrison led her team with steely focus. Harrison was no stranger to violent crimes, but this case unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. "We're starting from scratch here," she remarked during the first briefing at the station. "No clear motive, no witnesses. Let's comb through every inch of that crime scene until we find something that breaks this wide open." The interviews begin. The first course of action was to canvass the neighborhood. Officers went door to door, speaking to every resident, hoping someone had seen or heard something unusual between 7 p.m. and midnight, the suspected time frame of the killings. At first, the streets were an echo chamber of denials. "I didn't hear anything. The Carters were such nice people. No, I can't think of anyone who'd want to hurt them." However, a flicker of relevance came from an elderly neighbor who lived across the street. She mentioned seeing what she called a suspicious truck parked a few houses down from the Carters' place around 8:30 p.m. "It was a white pickup, kind of rusty, and there were two men inside," she said, gnawing her lip nervously. Although she couldn't provide a license plate, her account was logged as the first thread to pull. Next, the family's immediate circle was contacted. Eleanor's sister was called in to identify the bodies while police respectfully questioned her about the Carters' recent activities. Through stifled tears, she described them as a tight-knit family, utterly devoted to one another. "Eleanor had no enemies," the sister insisted. "I just can't imagine who could possibly do this." The statement stayed with the investigators. If the Carters were truly so beloved, what kind of rage or desperation could prompt such slaughter? Building the first profile. Based on initial observations at the scene, detectives suspected more than one perpetrator. The level of violence displayed against the victims, particularly the extreme force used on both parents, hinted at anger and emotion directed specifically at them, though it didn't immediately explain the children's killings. The severed phone cord struck Harrison as cold and deliberate. "They wanted to cut off all communication. This wasn't chaotic, this was planned," she noted during the team's second briefing. Yet other aspects didn't align with a calculated killer: the ransacked drawers, the food hastily tossed out of the refrigerator, valuables like rings or watches left untouched. "It's messy," Harrison remarked, circling details on a board. "This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, there's something else going on here." While the forensic team pieced together DNA samples, fingerprints and fibers from the home, the criminal profilers and psychologists began painting an early portrait. Multiple attackers, some degree of premeditation, high likelihood of personal connection, and a significant escalation of violence, suggesting this wasn't their first time committing a crime, although it might have been their first time crossing into such horrific territory. Digital trails and security cameras. The Carters' cell phone and landline records were pulled, revealing the last incoming call just 20 minutes before the suspected time of death, a call from William Carter's workplace. Unfortunately, it was trivial, relating to an overdue invoice. No text messages or emails offered any telltale signs of fear or suspicion on the part of the family. Detectives also scoured neighborhood security cameras for footage of the reported white truck. Hours of video revealed nothing definitive near the Carter street, but an image of a similar vehicle appeared at a gas station a few miles away earlier that evening. The blurry footage showed two unidentified men walking inside to pay for fuel, and then pulling out towards the direction of the subdivision. Though not enough for arrests, it reinforced the earlier lead about potential suspects with a vehicle: dirt under clean nails. Digging deeper into William Carter's workplace became inevitable. William had managed a construction project a few miles out of town, a project already known to have its fair share of tension. Employees spoke of payroll disputes and firings that had occurred recently. Harrison took particular interest in a man named Ray Daniels, who had been let go 3 weeks prior after angrily accusing William of holding back his paycheck. When questioned, Daniels raised eyebrows. Rough around the edges, with a penchant for confrontation, he initially denied even knowing where the Carters lived. "I don't hold grudges," Daniels said, almost scoffing at the suggestion he could be involved. Yet, the same neighbors with the truck sighting described two men walking in the area earlier in the week, one of whom vaguely fit Daniels' appearance. The pressure of the media. Meanwhile, as law enforcement delved deeper, the media frenzy surrounding the case began to build. "Small-town nightmare" and "families slaughtered in suburbia" headlines plastered every headline and broadcast. With public fear mounting, the community demanded answers. Town halls grew heated, neighbors accused each other of not paying attention or letting strangers roam too freely. For Harrison and her team, this additional weight of scrutiny pushed them harder but heightened the stakes of catching the right individuals, not rushing through missteps. "It's like peeling back layers of chaos," Harrison later admitted in an interview. "Everything you uncover feels significant, but you find yourself questioning whether it's actually going to lead you anywhere." A faint light in the distance. Despite the tangled start, the first few days of investigation produced one promising connection: the truck, the vague descriptions of two men, and the brewing tensions in William Carter's professional life. But beneath the surface of every emerging lead was a haunting question. Was the family targeted for something deeper than money? Or was it as simple and tragic as being in the wrong place at the wrong time? The groundwork for an exhaustive manhunt was now laid. Harrison stared at the names pinned to her corkboard, some suspects, some circumstantial figures, and others still anonymous. With regret laced through her determination, she muttered under her breath, "We owe it to them. We'll bring the monsters who did this to light." Clues from unfamiliar faces. As days passed, the investigators became increasingly desperate for new leads to breathe life into the stagnant investigation. The biggest clue they had so far was the vague account from a neighbor, the sighting of a suspicious truck near the Carter home on the night of the murders. To an outsider it might have sounded like a trivial detail, but to Detective Laura Harrison, it was a glimmer of hope in an otherwise impenetrable sea of uncertainty. The rusty white pickup, as described by the elderly neighbor, immediately became the centerpiece of an emerging theory. The detectives set to work combing through traffic camera footage, canvassing nearby blocks, and interviewing residents who lived anywhere near the Carter's neighborhood. Still, progress was agonizingly slow. "Check every angle," Harrison urged her team during a morning briefing. "Gas stations, convenience stores, motels. If there's a camera in this town that caught that truck, we're going to find it." Piecing together a trail. The break came 2 days later. A grainy surveillance tape from a 24-hour gas station situated 3 miles from the Carter residence captured a partial view of a white pickup pulling into the lot around 8:12 p.m. less than 30 minutes before the estimated time of the murders. Although the image quality was poor, the timestamp aligned ominously with the neighbor's report. Inside the station's convenience store, the attendant remembered 2 men entering together. The attendant wasn't able to recall much about their appearance, only that they looked rough, like not from around here. Detectives pored over hours of gas pump footage and noted the scratchy bumper, the mismatched driver's side door, and the heavy dust caking the exterior, all suggesting the vehicle belonged to someone actively on the road, someone transient. "This truck could have traveled 3 states over by now," another detective muttered during the post-analysis meeting. "Or it could be parked 2 blocks away from here," Harrison retorted. Her determination filled the air with a weight that no one dared to contradict. Widening the net. Investigators expanded their canvas outward, tapping into state highway patrols, nearby county sheriff's offices, and regional departments to link reports involving similar vehicles. Harrison also reached out to the FBI for assistance, hoping their vast database could flag crimes that shared characteristics: a white truck, forced entry burglaries, or violent home invasions. Days later, local officers stationed in the neighboring county relayed sightings of a similar truck near an Aurora motel, a spot known for temporary stays and the kind of clientele who left more trouble behind than memories. Detectives arrived quickly but discovered the truck and its occupants had checked out over 24 hours prior. The trail was rapidly cooling. Inside the motel's guest registry, the suspects had signed using the names John Smith and Rick Jones, obvious pseudonyms. But forensic teams reviewing parking lot footage identified 2 distinct shadows exiting the truck, both male, their features mostly obscured by hoods. One detail stood out. The taller of the 2 carried a plastic grocery bag containing what appeared to be a hammer and miscellaneous items. This seemingly unremarkable bag now became a chilling piece of the puzzle. Voices around town. As coverage of the Carter murders intensified and images of the white pickup truck were distributed in local news bulletins, the tip line erupted with calls from residents eager, or anxious, to report sightings of similar vehicles. Most provided false leads: delivery drivers, gardening contractors, or innocuous visitors passing through the area. But among the surplus of false alarms, a mechanic working at a tire shop east of the town provided a compelling deviation. "You said a white pickup?" the mechanic asked when shown the image. Yeah, I think two guys came into my shop last week looking for a spare tire. Said they were heading out west, and the truck looked about as beat up as that one. I remember because one of them got all defensive when I made a joke about the truck being barely roadworthy. He described the men as young, mid to late 20s, rugged, sullen, and carrying the kind of demeanor that made him uncomfortable. While the shop's surveillance cameras were temporarily offline during their visit, the account verified investigators' growing suspicion that the suspects weren't locals. If they're moving this fast, they've done this before, Harrison concluded grimly in the debrief. From suspicion to theory. The emerging portrait of the suspects painted a chilling image: transient individuals who carried their tools of destruction with them, opportunists who struck where they saw openings and didn't hesitate to use violence. The rusty truck wasn't just transportation, it was their traveling hideout, moving between small towns like a ghost, leaving devastation in their wake before disappearing into the next unsuspecting horizon. Detectives questioned whether the Carter family was specifically targeted or victims of unfortunate circumstance. The deliberate severing of the phone line indicated premeditation. These men didn't stumble into the Carters' home, they went in knowing they wouldn't let anyone call for help. The missing piece. Still, doubt lingered in Harrison's mind. Why this family? Why this town? The chaos of the crime scene offered no clarity on whether anger, desperation, or greed fueled the attackers. Were they simply intending to rob, only for things to spiral into bloodshed? Or had they set out with murder as their unspoken purpose all along? One of her detectives attempted to interject with a theory: what if this was personal? Maybe one of the Carters had a run-in with these guys before, an unpaid debt, a heated argument? Or maybe, she replied quietly, they're monsters who didn't need a reason. A lead that demanded speed. The clock continued to tick, and the menacing image of the white truck lingered like a specter over the investigation. Harrison's greatest fear wasn't losing the trail, it was not knowing when or where these men would strike next if they weren't caught. It's not just about the Carters anymore, she said solemnly to her team. If these men are out there, somewhere on the road, what's stopping them from doing it again? Within 48 hours, the net had widened from a tragic single-family crime to the chilling realization that the suspects might already be hunting their next target. Lost leads. The early days of the investigation brimmed with hopeful energy. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was pursued with vigor. But for every promising lead that investigators uncovered, dead ends loomed like a heavy fog pressing in on their path to the truth. The clues felt like fragments of a shattered mirror, seemingly important, frustratingly incomplete. With each passing day, the emotional toll began to wear on the detectives, and the once clear trail toward justice became a labyrinth of uncertainty. The wild chase for evidence. It started with the white pickup truck, the one thread dangling in the tangled mess of chaos that was the investigation. Every gas station, rest stop, and roadside diner within a 100-mile radius was canvassed. A few workers at a truck station about 30 miles north of the Carter home claimed they might have seen a beat-up white truck, but their descriptions were inconsistent. One swore it was parked near the entrance for hours, while another believed it had just passed through. Investigators were forced to sort through a flood of conflicting statements. Hours of exhausting interviews ultimately piled onto a singular, frustrating realization. No one, not even the witnesses, seemed entirely sure. The team grew desperate for hard evidence that could cement the connection between the white truck and the crime. Surveillance cameras in the area provided only fleeting, grainy glimpses of dusty vehicles driving past, none distinct enough to be identified. Analysts expanded the search grid to include neighboring states. Days turned into nearly a week. The truck, and more importantly its drivers, might as well have vanished into thin air. "We're chasing a ghost," muttered Detective Calvin Walker during a late-night review at the station. The room was heavy with exhaustion, coffee cups cluttered the desks, and evidence boards sagged under the weight of pinned photos and maps. Harrison, hunched over her laptop, didn't look up. "It isn't a ghost," she said firmly, her eyes scanning notes for a detail she might have missed. "We just haven't figured out where it's hiding." The pressure of public fear. Meanwhile, the pressure from the public began to rise. Media outlets broadcasted nightly updates on the case, while talk radio buzzed with armchair theories and unwarranted finger-pointing. Neighbors whispered about strangers loitering in parking lots or walking down familiar streets. A few even called the police to report their gut feelings about people they'd only known in passing. Harrison's station phones rang incessantly. One woman in tears claimed she recognized the truck from a town 50 miles away, only for officers to discover it belonged to a landscaper with no criminal record. Another watchful neighbor sent in blurry photos of every vehicle parking overnight in his suburban cul-de-sac, none of which matched even loosely. The community's fear was palpable. Parents began escorting their children to bus stops, doors were double-locked, and porch lights stayed on through the night. Still, as tips flooded in, so did dead ends. The missing weapon. The absence of a murder weapon nagged at every investigator on the case. The wounds at the scene suggested a blunt instrument, possibly a hammer or crowbar. Forensics scrutinized every blade of grass in the Carters' backyard, every inch of flooring throughout the home. They even drained a small pond in a nearby park after a jogger reported seeing something metallic. All they recovered were rusted bike parts. The weapon wasn't left behind, Harrison announced at a team meeting. They took it with them. Or worse, they disposed of it where we'll never find it. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too many cases go unsolved because critical evidence slipped out of reach. A silence hung over the room, amplifying the frustration coursing through the team. False starts and misleading suspects. The first round of questioning with family acquaintances yielded nothing of substance. Friends and co-workers of William Carter described him as humble, dependable, and too kind for his own good. No known debts, no feuds, no questionable acquaintances. There wasn't even a disgruntled ex-employee bitter enough to harbor a motive for murder. Then there was the neighbor who had initially seen the truck. When detectives pressed her further, she admitted she might have imagined it. Her confidence in her testimony dissolved, leaving investigators unsure if the only tangible clue they had was even real. By day 6, the case pivoted back to surrounding construction sites, given William's role as a project manager. But again, nothing stuck. A man named Rick Palmer, recently fired from one of William's subcontracting firms for drunken misconduct, seemed like a prime suspect, until his airtight alibi confirmed he was bar-hopping across town at the time of the murders. Cameras, witnesses, timestamps. The trail was too solid to punch through. With every promising suspect ruled out, the questions only grew louder. Why the Carters? Why steal almost nothing? Was this personal or random? When tension boils over inside the station, the mounting dead ends ignited visible tension among the task force. Harrison, a usually composed leader, slammed a folder onto her desk after a fruitless interrogation. "We're missing something," she vented, pacing the floor in frustration. "They would have left a crack, a fingerprint, a trail. People screw up. So where the hell is their screw up?" The team worked tirelessly as the sun sank into yet another icy Oregon night. Streetlights flickered on outside the station windows, mirroring the dim hope still burning among the weary investigators. The lonely road to clarity. As Harrison drove home that night, her mind replayed every detail they'd uncovered so far. The family's routine, their home, the surrounding streets. She traced the route the suspects might have taken with the truck, imagining their movements, their thoughts. Static buzzed on the police radio in her car. Whatever they did, they'll screw up, she thought to herself. They'll trust the wrong person, say the wrong thing. We've just got to hold on until then. But doubt still lingered. What if the clue they were chasing didn't exist? What if the killers truly were as cold and calculating as they seemed, covering every trace of their vile actions? For the first time in her career, Harrison feared that the leads they were chasing wouldn't just break. They might vanish entirely. Problems at the construction site. As the investigation unfolded, the detectives turned their attention to William Carter's professional life, seeking answers in the places where he spent most of his time outside of his home. William had been the project manager of a mid-sized construction site on the outskirts of Oregon, a job known for attracting its fair share of tension, frustrations, and disputes. Detective Laura Harrison suspected that the workplace could hold the key to understanding why someone would target William and, ultimately, his family. "We need to find out who had an axe to grind with William Carter," Harrison told her team during a morning briefing. She assigned detectives to pore over construction site records, financial documents, and employee histories, searching for signs of resentment, grievances, or outright threats. It wasn't long before they found a trail to follow, a job filled with tension. The construction site William managed was a sprawling, dusty expanse peppered with machinery, half-built structures, and stacks of concrete slabs. Interviews with employees painted the picture of a man who was hard-working, fair, and meticulous. But while many described him as easygoing, Others admitted that conflict at the site wasn't uncommon, especially with some employees, contractors, and vendors who didn't take kindly to William's heightened attention to detail. "He wasn't the kind of guy to let small things slide," said one laborer. "If you showed up late to work or cut corners in your tasks, you'd hear about it from Mr. Carter. But it wasn't personal, he just wanted things done the right way." Still, tensions in the workplace always find their breaking points, and the construction industry was no exception. One foreman recalled arguments regarding payroll delays and disputes over overtime, which had caused tempers to flare on more than one occasion. "There was this one guy, Ray Daniels." The foreman paused before continuing. "He got real salty about being let go. I remember he stormed off the site yelling something about how this ain't over yet." This ominous anecdote gave Harrison her first significant lead. She instructed her team to pull records on Ray Daniels and a list of other employees or contractors who might have been dismissed in recent months under similarly hostile circumstances. The payroll controversy. Digging deeper into the site's financial records, detectives uncovered a pattern of payroll issues that had been quietly brewing for months. Payments had been delayed in the past, and several employees had lodged complaints against the management, believing they were being shorted. Though these issues were eventually resolved, Harrison knew how something as sensitive as money could easily plant seeds of discontent. When confronted, the construction company's bookkeeper revealed that William had been tasked with breaking the bad news on payroll delays to the workers. He became the face of the problem, even though the delays weren't his fault. For some employees, however, William was the easiest and most visible target of their frustrations. "I had to tell some of these guys that their checks would be 2 weeks late," William had once vented to a colleague, according to an interview. "They didn't care that it was corporate's fault, they just blamed me because I was the one standing in front of them." These delays sparked a series of verbal altercations, raised voices on the site, accusations of favoritism, and in one particularly volatile instance, a physical altercation between William and a disgruntled worker. While the situation didn't result in any injuries, the memory was enough for Harrison to note it with concern. Tracking the fired employee's Ray Daniels, who had been loudly fired 3 weeks before the murders, quickly became a person of interest. He was a volatile personality with a history of run-ins with management. Daniels was known for showing up hungover or missing shifts altogether, an assistant foreman told detectives. William tolerated it as long as he could, but when Daniels threatened another worker, that was the last straw. Daniels hadn't gone quietly. Witnesses remembered him yelling obscenities about William and other co-workers, calling the firing bullshit and swearing they'd regret it. Adding to the concern, Daniels allegedly had a reputation for carrying a temper, and a crowbar. Detectives visited Daniels' last known address, a rundown trailer on the outskirts of the next town. Predictably, he wasn't home. The property was littered with junk cars, beer cans, and broken appliances, but there was no sign of the man himself. A search of his criminal history revealed a pattern of petty theft, bar fights, and one charge of assault. It wasn't much to go on, but enough to make Harrison's instincts tingle. "People don't just disappear," Harrison muttered to herself, staring at his mugshot. She put out a statewide bulletin for Daniels while instructing her team to keep digging into his known associates. The suspicious contractor. The investigation into the construction site revealed other potentially volatile relationships. There was a contractor named Bob Meyer, a longtime subcontractor with a reputation for cutting corners. William had reportedly clashed with Meyer just weeks before the murders after William confronted him for using lower-quality materials on the site. "Meyer hated being caught," said an anonymous worker. "He started yelling at William, accusing him of trying to ruin his reputation. Then he stormed off the site, telling anyone who would listen that William had it out for him." Meyer denied any involvement when interviewed, but his demeanor raised red flags. He was dismissive of the investigators' questions, providing vague, rehearsed answers. "I didn't have any problem with William," Meyer said, shrugging nervously. "The guy was just picky, always on my back about something." Despite his denials, his proximity to the construction site turmoil kept him on the list of potential suspects. Harrison believed Meyer's personality profile fit the kind of petty, vindictive rage that could boil over into something worse. Building a theory. By the end of the week, detectives had identified a small group of frustrated former employees, contractors, and even vendors. While none had immediately accessible evidence tying them directly to the murders, the pattern of disputes and William's central role in enforcing company rules made the workplace a pressure cooker of potential grudges. "It's almost too many suspects," Harrison confessed to her partner, pinning photos of Daniels, Meyer, and 3 other disgruntled workers onto the evidence board. "Any one of these guys could have snapped, or maybe one of them pulled the trigger and the others just helped." Her theory wasn't far-fetched. A coordinated attack by multiple individuals could explain the extreme violence and the chaotic yet deliberate nature of the crime scene at the Carter home. One man or a conspiracy? As the investigation into the construction site deepened, Harrison couldn't shake the possibility that the murder wasn't a random act of violence, but a cold-blooded plan rooted in revenge, jealousy, or anger. Was William Carter simply in the wrong position, overwhelmed by the weight of his responsibilities? Or had someone been scheming against him for weeks, pulling together allies with a shared agenda to destroy a family? The detectives knew they were circling something significant, but the more they sifted through, the more questions arose, and answers remained stubbornly out of reach. Tracking the victims' connections. As the investigation deepened, the detectives took a step back from the crime scene and the immediate evidence, focusing instead on the victims themselves. For Detective Laura Harrison, understanding the personal histories, relationships, and lives of the Carter family wasn't just a procedural task, it was the best way to uncover who might have held a grudge strong enough to lead to murder. Families like the Carters didn't just get slaughtered at random, Harrison reasoned. Somewhere in their past or present is the key. No one commits this level of violence for no reason, she told her team during a strategy session. With that thought guiding them, the detectives began piecing together the web of relationships that surrounded the Carter family, the happy faces and hidden tensions. From an outsider's perspective, the Carters epitomized the American dream. William was a devoted dad, a hard worker, and a reliable project manager at a mid-sized construction firm. Eleanor, his wife, was equally admired, a former elementary school teacher turned homemaker, who was deeply involved in community activities and PTA meetings. The couple was known to host backyard BBQs and holiday gatherings, making them fixtures in their neighborhood social life. "Nothing suspicious," Eleanor's best friend Karen Lang insisted during a tearful interview. "They were good people, too good to make enemies, you know?" But, as Harrison knew from years on the job, outward appearances often masked hidden tensions. She asked questions that probed deeper. Who disagreed with William? Who envied Eleanor? Who might have harbored resentment? "A small town like this," Harrison murmured, "is like a pond. Throw a stone and ripples touch everyone. Someone must have been angry enough or broken enough to take it this far." Family in mourning and suspicion. The family's inner circle was the first layer to uncover. Detectives interviewed Eleanor's sister, Linda, who had been the one to help identify the bodies. She was grief-stricken but cooperative, describing how close the sisters had always been. "Eleanor was the heart of her family," Linda said, clutching a tissue as her red eyes brimmed with tears. "She didn't have any enemies. None of us do, really. We're just normal people." But Harrison wasn't so quick to buy into the idea of a completely harmonious extended family. Statistics pointed to family and acquaintances as the most likely suspects in cases like these. Through cross-checking emails, phone logs, and even Eleanor's past social media posts, subtle hints of tension began to bubble to the surface. There were spats about money, nothing dramatic but enough to merit second glances. An old Facebook argument between Eleanor and a distant cousin over a family inheritance had grown surprisingly public a year prior before it fizzled out. Detectives also found that William's father, a retired factory worker in another state, had fallen into a bitter estrangement with him over disagreements about caring for their mother before her death. "He hasn't spoken to me or his family in years," William's brother admitted when interviewed. "I doubt he'd go as far as this, but I guess anything's possible when you let anger build up for too long." Each potential family dispute added a ripple to the investigation's already murky waters. Friends turned suspects. The next layer of the investigation looked into the Carters' friends and social circles, from work colleagues and dinner party guests to neighbors and members of Eleanor's volunteer committees. "Do you think this might have been a robbery gone wrong?" a colleague of William's asked during an interview. But nothing was missing aside from the family's lives. No valuables had been taken, not even jewelry left lying in plain sight. "This wasn't about money," Harrison explained to the team after every interview. "This was about something far uglier." A church friend revealed that Eleanor had confided in her about a neighbor dispute just 6 months earlier. "She told me this couple next door started parking on her side of the street after she asked them not to. Petty stuff, but Eleanor said she could feel that woman giving her dirty looks every time she'd go to check the mail," the friend recalled. That neighbor, Sophia Norwood, was confronted by the detectives not long after. She dismissed the arguments as nothing serious, calling Eleanor a little overprotective about the neighborhood rules. But Harrison couldn't ignore how defensive Sophia became, or the way her husband, an unemployed construction worker, seemed oddly withdrawn around questions regarding William. The couple wasn't eliminated as suspects but was filed as lower priorities compared to more pressing leads. Re-examining William's colleagues, William Carter's professional relationships proved to be the most turbulent, especially after further interviews with subcontractors on the construction sites. Detectives learned that William had once mediated a few particularly heated arguments between himself and surly contractors guilty of cutting corners. While these disputes were ostensibly resolved on site, Harrison wondered whether those petty arguments left emotional scars that festered longer than anyone admitted. Some of William's former colleagues revealed additional tensions surrounding delayed payrolls due to corporate finance mishaps. He was the middleman, one co-worker explained. Don't get me wrong, William was just doing his job, but when people get told repeatedly that they need to wait for their paychecks, it's hard to not point fingers. The name Ray Daniels, a disgruntled former worker known for his explosive temper, kept cropping up in interviews. One subcontractor mentioned seeing Daniels at a bar just a week before the murders, loudly ranting about how bosses deserve what's coming to them. With Daniels' unsteady behavior and well-known hatred for William, his name steadily rose closer to the top of Harrison's suspect list. Old friends, new questions. Then came the old college roommate of William's, Robert "Robbie" Grayson. Robbie had recently reconnected with William over a construction investment deal that fell apart. Emails between the two painted a story of concern from William's side, polite rejections layered with unease about Robbie's newfound business ventures. To be honest, that guy was always unpredictable, a mutual acquaintance reported. Back in the day, Robbie could blow up over the dumbest things, getting snubbed at a party or losing a card game. If William had to turn him down for a project, that could have pissed Robbie off. When questioned, Robbie denied any recent contact beyond casual emails. "He was my friend," Robbie said calmly. "There's no way I could ever hurt him or his family." While Robbie maintained this stance, his defensive posture and erratic speech during the interview only made detectives more suspicious, rebuilding the web. By the end of the week, Harrison's evidence board looked more like a mosaic of acquaintances, family members, business partners, and neighbors. Red string linked names to motives, small grudges developed into potential threats, and trust turned into tension. But still, something was missing. "It's like we're drowning in possibilities," Harrison muttered, her hand resting on William and Eleanor's pinned photo at the center of the board. "Everyone connected to them has an excuse or a reason, but no one has confessed to the smallest mistake. Somewhere, someone slipped. We just have to find who." A shattered image. The further the detectives chased each thread, the darker the picture of the Carter family's idyllic life became. Beneath the surface of barbecues and warm smiles there were disputes, unresolved arguments, long-held grudges, and individuals who may have smiled at them in public while loathing them in private. To solve this case, Harrison realized, they needed the one final piece that would connect motive with opportunity. And as the web tightened, she couldn't help but feel the killer or killers were among those smiling faces hiding in plain sight. The interstate manhunt. By the second week of the investigation, the pieces of the puzzle were becoming clearer but also more urgent. The white pickup truck, the descriptions of two unidentified men, and the growing list of potential motives were starting to form a picture of cruel intent. But the suspects themselves, like shadows, remained just out of grasp. What had once been a quiet neighborhood murder had now become a statewide manhunt. Detective Laura Harrison felt the weight of time pressing harder than ever. "This isn't just local anymore," she told her team. "Whoever these guys are, they're not sitting still. They're on the move, and if we're not fast enough, another family could be next." Tracking a ghost on the road. The white pickup truck had been the elusive centerpiece of the investigation since the beginning, appearing briefly on gas station cameras before disappearing into the night. But now, with coordinated efforts from surrounding counties and states, patrol units across Oregon and beyond were watching for the vehicle. Every abandoned barn, hometown motel, and truck stop along major highways was a potential hiding place. Then, a break came late one evening. A highway patrol officer in Northern California radioed in a sighting of a vehicle matching the truck's description, parked at the edge of a desolate rest stop. The truck was gone before officers arrived, but surveillance footage from the area confirmed two men moving around the truck. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up. The other, shorter and wiry, seemed to fidget nervously, looking around in a hurry. "Look at the way they move," Harrison said as she pored over the blurry video with her team. "Not just casual travelers, they're making sure no one's watching them too closely. They're trying to stay off the radar." The sighting narrowed the search radius. The truck headed south along Interstate 5, which cut through California and opened an unsettling question. Were they running simply to escape, or were they heading toward their next target? Contacting federal assistance. With the suspects' increasing mobility, Harrison knew her team couldn't do it alone. Calls were made to the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force requesting additional expertise and resources. Agents familiar with interstate crimes arrived, mapping the potential routes the suspects could take. Banking on the truck's dated appearance, the mismatched doors, the rust-coated bumper, profiles focusing on transient lifestyles were developed. These men weren't simply staying in one place, they were living off the grid wherever possible. "We're not just chasing killers," said Special Agent Mark Evans during the first joint briefing. "We're chasing predators. They're calculating. Every rest stop they pass, they're considering their options. Stay low, switch vehicles, find cash, move again. They won't make it easy." The collaboration helped federal officers widen the net. Gas stations, motels, pawn shops, and even roadside diners became potential intel sources. Flyers with the suspects' descriptions and images of the notorious white truck were distributed to jurisdictions across multiple states. The pressure was mounting. The motel sighting. A pivotal moment arrived when a call came in from a Texaco gas station in Idaho. An attendant recognized the truck from a news story and remembered a pair of men filling up near midnight. They seemed in a rush, the worker recalled. One guy paid in cash while the other stayed at the pump, nervously looking around. Took off before I even put their receipt on the counter. Officers rushed to the area but once again found themselves a step behind. The truck had surfaced earlier at a nearby roadside motel. Piles of trash were discovered in their vacated room, cigarette butts, liquor bottles, and fast food wrappers, but the men had checked out less than 6 hours before detectives arrived. One critical detail stood out. An employee at the motel recalled seeing one of the men with what looked like blood on his boot. It wasn't enough for an arrest without physical evidence, but it was a chilling reminder of who they were dealing with. "This isn't desperation," Harrison said after reviewing the files. "They're comfortable moving like this. It's like they've done it before. The blood, the paranoia at a gas station, this isn't the first time they've left bodies behind." Pressure builds. News of the manhunt went nationwide. Cable news anchors used phrases like "the pack of two" and "hunters on the move" to describe the elusive criminals, feeding public paranoia. It wasn't long before tips flooded hotlines from as far away as Arizona and Nevada, detailing sightings of similar trucks or suspicious duos. "We're drowning in calls," said one overwhelmed dispatcher. "Half the people calling think every old truck is the one we're looking for. The other half just want to feel involved." Each call had to be followed up on, and it stretched the task force painfully thin. Harrison felt the tension growing among her team as exhaustion set in. Leads came and went without resolution. False sightings diverted resources down dead ends. Even the federal agents were starting to feel the strain. "They're playing with us," muttered Detective Walker one night, slamming his coffee mug onto his desk. "They've killed a family, and now they're just out there, like ghosts." But Harrison remained steadfast. "Ghosts make mistakes too," she replied quietly, "and when they do, we'll be there." A reckless decision. The break they'd been waiting for came through recklessness. A pawn shop owner in eastern Nevada reported two men attempting to sell a gold watch engraved with the initials EC. A horrific clue matching one of Eleanor Carter's most cherished possessions. Security footage confirmed her watch and the suspects' faces, although one wore a baseball cap pulled low to conceal his features. It wasn't just about pawning stolen goods. The transaction had sealed the suspects' trails with a fatal arrogance. Interstate crimes weren't just the concern of the states anymore. The FBI declared the suspects officially classified as most wanted fugitives. Officers now had names for the men, Mark Watson and Jared Briggs. Both had extensive criminal records and were previously implicated in violent burglaries but had disappeared months earlier after skipping parole hearings. "The watch was their mistake," Harrison said, holding up the pawn report like a trophy in the war they'd all waged. "They thought they could ditch the evidence, and now they've given us exactly what we need." The chase tightens. With names, photos, and locations connecting the pair more concretely to the Carter murders, the task force turned its focus onto high-priority searches of highways and rural areas. With the suspect's truck tied to active warrants, automated license plate scanners were placed along major roads. Lines of communication tightened with law enforcement agencies across 7 states. Finally, 2 weeks after the initial massacre of the Carter family, a patrol car outside of Amarillo, Texas, pulled over a white pickup truck with mismatched doors. The officer approached cautiously, hand resting on his holster, and ordered the occupant to step out. Mark Watson sat behind the wheel, disheveled and defiant, muttering curses as he was apprehended without incident. Meanwhile, Jared Briggs's trail dissolved temporarily but reignited days later at an abandoned barn 50 miles south of Dallas. After a brief but tense standoff involving SWAT teams, he was captured as well, reluctantly surrendering when cornered. From hunters to hunted. The arrest of Watson and Briggs ended the physical manhunt, but the psychological weight remained. Harrison and her team had spent weeks chasing shadows, only to realize the violence they wrought carried deeper scars than the trail of broken laws. The suspects were no longer just names or mugshots, they were monsters who had recklessly defiled an innocent family. "We found them," Harrison whispered to herself as cuffs were slapped on Briggs. "But nothing we do will undo what they've done." The final puzzle. Even though the chase across state lines had ended, the next chapter of justice, the trial, was only beginning. Watson and Briggs now sat in interrogation rooms miles apart, their arrogance beginning to crumble under the weight of evidence. The remnants of a brutal crime spree had been pieced together over weeks, and now, step by step, both men would account for everything they'd done, or face the silence of their own guilt. A major breakthrough from a small detail. The case had moved forward in agonizing increments. Every promising lead seemed destined to fizzle out as detectives like Laura Harrison and her team worked ceaselessly. The suspects remained elusive ghosts, and the thin threads connecting suspicion to proof seemed as fragile as spider silk. But then, in a twist that Harrison herself could only describe as fate, it was one small, overlooked detail, something almost invisible to the naked eye, that unwound the tightly wound knot of the investigation. The detail came from a place most detectives might have dismissed, a forgotten shoe mark at the edge of tragedy. The clue in the carpet. Forensic experts had combed the Carter residence for over a week, meticulously bagging and labeling fibers, prints, and every speck of potential evidence. Among the items collected were faint but distinct muddy shoe prints tracked near the back door of the house, just outside the kitchen. Initially, they had been attributed to members of the forensic team, or perhaps one of the responding officers, splashing through the damp earth during the chaotic aftermath. But Harrison wasn't convinced. As much as she trusted her team, something about the prints didn't feel right to her. They were sharper, too shallow, and inconsistent with standard-issue boots worn by first responders. Setting aside her skepticism, she sent an inquiry to the lab, instructing them to compare the prints against the known footwear of everyone who had been at the scene. When the results came back days later, her instincts were vindicated. The muddy prints didn't match any of her officers, they matched no one known to have been officially present at the scene. "Lab's calling them a possible outsider's footprint," said Detective Calvin Walker, flipping through the report during a morning briefing. "It's a men's size 11, tread pattern's weirdly specific. Looks like it belongs to an older brand of hiking boots." "That's not just outsider, that's our killer," Harrison said, feeling a spark of determination light within her. A footprint wasn't a smoking gun, but its rarity made it promising. If they could trace it, they might be able to identify the exact model, even narrow it down to specific towns or stores. The quest for the boots. Harrison tasked her team with tracking down the origin of the tread pattern. Forensic analysts used tireless comparison databases, narrowing the tread to a model sold by a mid-range brand popular among blue-collar workers called Canyon Trails. The hiking boots were common enough, with tens of thousands of pairs sold nationwide, but there was a catch. This specific print matched an older design discontinued 3 years earlier. "That's something," Harrison said as she stared at the files spread across her desk. "Uncommon but not impossible to find. We need to reel this in." Her team began reaching out to shoe manufacturers, distributors, and retail chains across the region. It was the kind of grunt work that detectives loathed, pouring through pay logs, shipping manifests, and invoices, but Harrison pushed through with laser focus. With every piece of information stacked on their war table, they soon found themselves narrowing the geography of their search. The Canyon Trail's size 11 boots had been predominantly sold in the southeastern United States. More importantly, those invoices tracked a consistent shipment to mom-and-pop stores located in parts of Alabama. This was 3 years ago, Walker reminded her. Maybe the guy bought them, tossed them somewhere, or handed them off to someone else. Doesn't matter, Harrison responded. These boots are rare enough by now that we don't need everyone who bought a pair. We just need one. Our one. Piecing together a region. As the search advanced, Harrison seized on another piece of information. During interviews with the managers of smaller retail stores, one clerk remembered recent customers mentioning Canyon Trail's boots in passing. A couple of guys were looking for old models, the clerk had said. Couldn't figure out why they wanted such specific ones, but they left with nothing. Suspicion began to creep higher. Using transaction records, Harrison's team identified 3 sets of buyers in the Alabama area who had specifically requested the discontinued line of boots. When cross-referenced against criminal databases, one name stood out like a beacon in the dark. Mark Watson. Mark Watson and the Trail to Disaster. Watson, the driver of the white truck now firmly tied to the Carter murders through eyewitnesses and pawn records, had an unsettling rap sheet that included petty theft, burglary, and violent assault. But more importantly, his previous arrests placed him in Alabama at the exact time the Canyon Trail's boots would have been widely available. If he owned these boots, Harrison said to her team, then we've just dragged him out from wherever he's hiding. But Watson wasn't the only person they were after. They still needed the second man, the shorter, wiry accomplice suspected to be Jared Briggs. Forensic specialists now analyzed the trace mud embedded in the original boot impressions. To everyone's surprise, the dirt didn't match soil from northern Oregon, where the Carters lived. Instead, it matched deposits consistent with the southern wetlands of Alabama. They brought dirt from home, Walker said in disbelief while Harrison stared at the report. They didn't just bring dirt, she muttered. They brought their past, and their past holds everything we need to close this thing. Turning pressure into results. The shoes were a breakthrough, but they weren't the closure Harrison craved. Pressure continued to mount. Families across the state lived in fear since the Carter murders dominated nightly news stories. The suspects' names, faces, and the infamous truck were plastered on every local channel, forcing Watson and Briggs deeper underground. But Harrison knew better than anyone. Cracks always form when the walls close in. These guys are running scared, she insisted to her team. Scared people make careless mistakes. Unearthing a purchase tied to a discontinued pair of boots was more than circumstantial evidence. It was the thread they could tug hard enough to unravel everything. With the white pickup truck tied to pawned items linked to the Carters and Watson's shoe records dragging him further into focus, the net tightened, a hidden detail that spilled blood. By the end of the week, Harrison paced her office, staring blankly at the corkboard filled with evidence. Footprints, shoes, dirt, pawn records, 2 faces, the hunters who became key pieces of their case. She thumbed a pen nervously, rethinking every decision made up to this point. Could something so mundane as a pair of boots truly hold the gateway to guilt? But it wasn't just the boots, it was the arrogance, the carelessness of trying to sidestep responsibility. These weren't merely missteps in a physical sense, they were the metaphorical footprints criminals leave every time they underestimate the people chasing them. As Harrison stared one last time at the footprint analysis, she whispered to herself, "This isn't just a detail. This is the noose that's going to tighten around their necks." Arresting the first suspects. After weeks of relentless investigation, missteps, and false leads, Detective Laura Harrison and her team were finally closing in. The key piece of evidence, a gold watch engraved with the initials EC pawned by Mark Watson and Jared Briggs, had tightened the noose. A coordinated effort with state and federal law enforcement tracked their infamous white pickup truck through an intricate web of sightings and surveillance footage. The manhunt, which had stretched from Oregon through multiple states, was nearing its explosive conclusion. But as any seasoned detective like Harrison knew, there was never such a thing as a clean, quiet arrest in cases like this. The suspects were desperate, dangerous, and armed, and desperation, she thought bitterly, made men like Watson and Briggs even more of a threat. Closing the distance. The break came in the form of a tip from a roadside diner in Amarillo, Texas. The owner had called a police tip line after noticing 2 men who matched the widely circulated descriptions. According to the report, The men had parked a beat-up white truck along the edge of the property and ordered food to go, but their behavior was suspicious. They were fidgety, the diner owner recounted to authorities, kept looking out the window, not really paying attention to what I was saying. The tall one, he barely touched his food, but the skinny one kept pacing, like he was expecting someone to bust through the door any second. Harrison reviewed the timeline of the sighting and cross-referenced it with reported highway routes and nearby surveillance footage. "They're not staying still anymore," she muttered, studying the map spread across the conference table. "They're running, hard. This is where they're likely to make mistakes." A patrol officer was dispatched to confirm the tip before declaring it valid. Less than an hour after the call came through, the officer spotted the truck parked at a shady, low-budget motel, its rusted bumper and mismatched doors unmistakable. The motel standoff law enforcement moved quickly, surrounding the building under the cover of night. Harrison was flown in to oversee the operation, coordinating with the FBI task force and local SWAT teams. Dressed in tactical vests and equipped with riot shields, the officers prepared for what they knew could turn into a bloodbath. Both Watson and Briggs had violent histories, and the gruesome nature of the Carter family murders left little doubt in anyone's mind. These men wouldn't go down without a fight. Harrison held a police radio in one hand and her Glock holstered tightly at her side. "We do this clean," she instructed the SWAT commander. "No cowboy theatrics. They might be animals, but we're professionals." Inside the motel, Watson and Briggs were holed up in a dingy, single-bed room on the second floor. Crumpled fast food wrappers littered the floor, alongside beer cans and cigarette butts. A pistol sat on the nightstand between them, while Briggs nervously paced, flipping through a stained local map. Watson, calm and calculating, sat at the edge of the bed, watching the crack beneath the door as though he knew what was coming. "We shouldn't have stopped here," Briggs hissed, his voice trembling. "We should have kept driving, man, I told you. They gotta be honest by now." Watson grunted dismissively. "Relax, they're chasing ghosts. You see anyone knocking on our door? Didn't think so." He reached for a beer, but the sharp intake of breath from his partner stopped him. "What the hell was that?" Briggs whispered, pointing to the window. Red and blue sirens flashed faintly in the distance. "They're here." The raid. The SWAT team made their move at 3:14 a.m., breaching the room with precision. First came the flashbang, an eruption of light and deafening sound that disoriented the suspects. Then came the flood of bodies. Heavily armed officers stormed in, barking commands to get on the floor. Briggs dropped instantly, his hands flying behind his head as he yelled, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" Watson, however, lunged for the handgun on the nightstand. But before his fingers could make contact, a swift blow from the butt of a rifle knocked him backward onto the bed. Officers shouted over the chaos, pinning both suspects to the ground and securing handcuffs within seconds. Harrison stood in the hallway, listening to the commotion as she resisted the impulse to storm in herself. She clenched her fists as the confirmation came through her radio that the suspects were in custody. Interrogation, the breaking point. Back at the station, the interrogation room was small, fluorescent lights casting harsh reflections off the metal table. Mark Watson sat across from Harrison, his arms crossed, his face still swollen from the earlier scuffle. He stared at her with cold defiance, refusing to speak more than a few grunted responses. "Let's skip the games, Mark," Harrison said, folding her arms and leaning forward. "You were sloppy, you know that, right? Your prints are everywhere. You weren't as careful as you think you were." He simply scowled. "Eleanor Carter's gold watch, that's what sealed it," she continued calmly, her words tightening the air in the room. "You were arrogant enough to pawn it. That, on top of the truck, the footprints and witnesses ready to ID you." She paused, locking eyes with him. "We've got you, Mark. You can make this easier on yourself, or you can keep acting tough. Either way, you're going down." Watson gritted his teeth but said nothing. Behind the one-way mirror, detectives observed the tension building. Meanwhile, Jared Briggs was breaking under pressure in the adjacent room. "Look, it wasn't my idea," he stammered, visibly sweating as another officer questioned him. "This was Watson's thing, okay? He planned everything. He told me it was going to be a robbery, that's it. I didn't know he'd—" Briggs stopped, his voice choking. "I didn't know he was going to kill them." Harrison was summoned to witness Briggs's unraveling. She stood silently by the mirror, listening as the wiry man reached his breaking point. "We shouldn't have gone in there. They were innocent. I told him to stop. But he wouldn't listen." Bringing the monsters to light. By the end of the day, the suspects were processed, their names released to the media. Mark Watson and Jared Briggs, arrested in connection with the brutal slaying of the Carter family. The relentless search was finally over, but for Harrison and her team, the battle was far from finished. Now the focus would shift to building an ironclad case, ensuring the killers faced the full weight of justice. As Watson and Briggs were escorted out of the building in chains, reporters swarmed the perimeter. Harrison watched from inside, her arms folded and her face unreadable. Inwardly she felt the same swelling anger that pushed her through the case's darkest hours. "They're off the streets," she murmured to herself, "but nothing we do will bring that family back." The shadows of the motel arrest would linger for a long time, a reminder of the depravity lurking beneath the surface of human nature. For Harrison, there was no celebrating, only the cold satisfaction of knowing two killers would never harm another soul again. The chilling confession. It happened late in the evening, long after most of the precinct had gone quiet. Detective Laura Harrison sat behind the glass in the observation room, watching Mark Watson lean back in his chair, utterly defiant. Across the hall, Jared Briggs was pacing in small, frantic circles inside his interrogation room, sweat dripping from his forehead. For days, the two men had stonewalled investigators, stubbornly refusing to explain the horrors they had unleashed on the Carter family. But cracks were starting to form, small signs of guilt creeping into their body language. The moment of truth was close, but Harrison knew one thing for certain: the truth wasn't going to come easily. "Monsters like them," she muttered under her breath, "don't confess until their backs are against the wall." The breaking of Jared Briggs was the first to fracture under the weight of evidence. Unlike Watson, who glared at anyone who dared enter his interrogation room, Briggs was jittery, visibly scared. His hands trembled as he repeatedly rubbed his face. He had the look of a man caught in an unrelenting nightmare, and Harrison knew it was only a matter of time. She decided to confront him directly. Detective Calvin Walker sat across from Briggs, flipping through the dossier of evidence. Harrison watched from behind the mirror as Walker laid down the dismantled case piece by piece. "The stolen watch with Eleanor's initials, you pawned it. The receipts connect you. The white truck, it's yours. Witnesses saw you leave the motel. And let's not forget the footprints from the Carter home, size 9. That's you, isn't it, Jared?" I don't know what you're talking about," Briggs stammered, his voice unconvincing, his eyes darting between Walker and the corners of the room, almost as if looking for an escape route. Walker leaned forward, his voice dropping into a lower, menacing tone. "We have you dead to rights, Jared. We know what you did. So tell me, was this all your idea, or did Mark drag you into it?" At the mention of Watson's name, Briggs froze. Without realizing it, his breathing became shallow, and the corners of his mouth twitched, the unmistakable signs of a man ready to talk. "He's the one who did it!" Briggs blurted out suddenly, breaking the silence. His words came tumbling out like a dam breaking under pressure. It wasn't supposed to go like that, I swear!" Walker leaned back in his chair, giving Briggs his moment to unravel. The man was shaking now, both hands gripping the edge of the desk as he rushed to justify himself. The plan gone wrong. "Mark said it'd be simple," Jared Briggs began, his voice trembling as he spoke. "He said we'd get in, grab some valuables, scare the family a little if we had to, and get out. That was it. Just a quick job. Nothing else. I didn't want to kill nobody." Harrison stepped into the room at that moment, her piercing glare silencing Briggs momentarily. She stood over him, her tone cold and steady. "But you did, Jared. You didn't just scare them. You slaughtered 4 people in cold blood, a father, a mother, and 2 kids. Tell me why." Briggs shook his head violently, his whole body trembling. "I didn't want to. I swear I begged him to stop after—" His words trailed off, his skin pale as though whatever memory lingered in his head was too much to handle. Harrison leaned in closer. "After what, Jared? What happened in that house?" Briggs swallowed hard, his hands balled into fists on the table. Slowly, reluctantly, the horrific story began to spill out. The night of the crime. "It was Mark," Briggs said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was furious before we even got there, kept muttering about how Carter needed to pay, how he had it coming, said William owed him, something about one of his construction jobs screwing him over." According to Briggs, Watson saw William Carter as the scapegoat for years of personal failures. An ex-con with a long list of bad debts and failed ventures, Watson's grudge against the construction manager had grown into a seething hatred. He blamed William for losing a subcontracting gig when Carter had reported his corner-cutting work to higher management. The break-in was supposed to be his revenge, make Carter pay, humiliate him, Briggs explained. His voice shook as he described what followed. "We cut the phone line first. Mark didn't want them calling for help. Then we broke in through the back door. The family was eating dinner. God, they looked so happy." Harrison's stomach tightened. She had been to crime scenes countless times, but hearing it from the man who did it brought the grotesque reality back in vivid detail. "William stood up when he heard us come in," Briggs confessed. "He told us to take whatever we wanted and leave, but Mark just kept shouting, calling him a fraud, a cheat. Eleanor started screaming for someone to call 911, and that's when Mark just snapped." "Snapped how?" Harrison pressed, her voice steady but sharp. "He hit William with something, a hammer or crowbar. I didn't see it at first, but the sound—" Briggs paused, his whole body shaking now. "The sound stayed with me." Eleanor ran to her husband only to be grabbed by Watson, who brutally restrained her. Briggs broke down, mumbling about the blood, the frantic cries of Emily and little Noah. "The kids! I couldn't look at them. Mark said we couldn't leave witnesses, and he just... Jared buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Watson's brutality. Harrison excused herself briefly, leaving Briggs to his breakdown. Outside, she took a moment to steady herself, her fists tightening at the thought of Watson. She stepped into Watson's interrogation room next, where he remained as cold and defiant as ever, his eyes locked on hers. "Jared's already talking," Harrison said, crossing her arms. "He says this was all your idea. He says you killed them because of some job you lost." Watson smirked, leaning back in his chair. "That little rat always runs his mouth. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about." But his facade of calm faltered slightly when Harrison leaned forward, her voice dropping into an icy whisper. "He told us about the hammer, Mark. He told us how you didn't hesitate, didn't care, and how you killed the kids." For the first time, Watson's jaw tightened. Harrison pressed on. "You can play tough, but nothing you say will make this go away. We've got your footprints, your truck, and now your partner flipping on you. It's over, Mark." The chilling final words. In the end, Watson offered no emotional breakdown, no tears, and no remorse. Instead, he sneered at Harrison and muttered, "They got what they deserved. People like Carter think they're better than everyone else, walking all over us. I showed him." Harrison stared at him for a few seconds, her stomach churning at the lack of humanity in his voice. "You didn't show him anything, Mark. All you did was destroy a family and ruin your own life. You'll rot in a cell, and for what? Your bruised ego?" Watson didn't respond, his eyes lowering to the table in silence, the weight of truth. By the end of the night, the confessions were laid bare and documented. Briggs's breakdown painted a picture of a reluctant accomplice, a man too cowardly to stop the massacre but racked with guilt afterward. Watson's cold, matter-of-fact admissions left no doubt about who had truly driven the horrific events. Both men were processed, their grim confessions sealing their fates. Harrison sat in silence as the reality of the case caught up with her. The pieces fit. Someone's grudge, petty and selfish, had escalated into unimaginable violence, and now, while the Carters were gone forever, at least their killers were no longer free to walk the streets. "There's no closure in this," she admitted quietly to herself, "but at least now, the truth is out." A string of horrors. The Carter family murders were only the beginning, or more accurately, the tragic endpoint of a blood trail that had stretched across state lines and devastated multiple lives. As the confessions of Mark Watson and Jared Briggs unraveled under interrogation, Detective Laura Harrison and her team pieced together a horrifying timeline, one riddled with violence, chaos, and chilling intentionality. "It wasn't just about the Carters," Harrison explained in a briefing with her team. "These men didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy a family. This behavior is pathological. They've been doing this for months, maybe years, and the Carters were simply the worst escalation yet. The unveiling of a pattern." The timeline began to emerge when the FBI brought in criminal profilers to assist Harrison's team. Files began stacking up on the conference room table. Unsolved break-ins, brutal assaults, and missing persons reports stretching all the way from Alabama to Washington. The incidents shared haunting similarities: forced entry into quiet suburban homes, selective looting of valuables, and escalating violence. "These aren't opportunists," Special Agent Mark Evans from the FBI stated during a meeting. "This is a carefully crafted modus operandi. They choose isolated homes, avoid confrontations unless necessary, and leave before law enforcement can respond. Except in the Carter case, something broke that pattern." Harrison turned to the string of cases pinned to the board. Each piece of evidence, blurry surveillance photos, grainy footprints in mud, told part of the story. but none of them showed the horrific escalation that occurred in Oregon. "Until now they've been predators," she said, scanning the room. "But the Carter case wasn't about theft, it was rage. They didn't just want to take what they could, they wanted to destroy." The Alabama break-in. The pair's string of crimes dated back at least 18 months. It had begun in Alabama, where Watson and Briggs appeared to have started small. Henderson County Sheriff's Office provided records of a quiet neighborhood burglary. CCTV footage from a convenience store showed a beat-up white truck parked in the shadows less than half a mile from the home. Inside, an elderly couple had been tied up while the house was ransacked for cash and jewelry. The couple survived, but the trauma lingered. "They were so careful back then," Harrison murmured as the report was read aloud. "No one died. They cleaned up evidence. They even wore gloves. It was just practice for them." The Alabama couple, however, provided haunting testimony of Watson's chilling control. The husband recalled Watson whispering, "Don't think about calling anyone. You won't live long enough." Even Jared Briggs, in his confessions, admitted that Watson thrived on the power he had over his victims. "That man," Briggs said, tears stinging his eyes, "he didn't rob because he needed the money. He robbed to make himself feel bigger than everyone else." The Kentucky gas station incident. Months later, their crimes moved north. In Kentucky, they targeted a rural family living on the outskirts of town. This time Watson's rage took a more violent turn. A lone father and his teenage son were home at the time of the crime. The father was pistol-whipped and left unconscious while his son suffered a fractured collarbone after being kicked down the stairs. Harrison scanned the photos from the Kentucky incident in horror. "This is where control started slipping," she remarked. "They were no longer just breaking in and tying people up. Watson was getting angrier and more dangerous." According to FBI profiler Evans, this uptick in violence suggested Watson was spiraling. He was no longer satisfied with stealing, he needed to dominate. "People like him don't stop," Evans told Harrison later in private. "The violence becomes addictive. It's no longer just about the loot, it's about what they can take from their victims emotionally. Fear, pain, submission, that's what drives them." The Nevada death. What began as a pattern of burglaries veered into outright murder 8 months before the Carter tragedy. It was in Nevada, on the outskirts of Reno, that authorities connected the crimes to Watson and Briggs through painstaking analysis. The crime involved a single woman, Clara Mitchell, who had recently relocated to the area. She was found battered to death in her living room after what appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. "We always thought it might have been someone random passing through," the local sheriff admitted to Harrison's team in a briefing, frustration lacing his voice. "Now it looks like Watson and Briggs had been hunting for the perfect victim, and she was it." Jared Briggs, during one of his emotional breakdowns, confessed to the Nevada murder in graphic detail. "Mark didn't even blink," Briggs choked out between sobs. "She kept screaming, she kept begging us to stop, and Mark just smiled, like he enjoyed it." The confession chilled Harrison to her core. She could see Briggs's guilt eating him alive, but she also recognized the cowardice in his tears. He had stood by and done nothing while Watson rampaged, jumping state lines. The more law enforcement dug into the pair's interstate history, the more horrifying the scope of their crimes became. Washington, Idaho, and Montana all produced police reports that bore Watson and Briggs's fingerprints. Some victims were lucky enough to survive unscathed physically, forced to watch as their valuables and heirlooms were shoved into bags. Others weren't so fortunate. One of the most infamous cases prior to the Carter family was from Idaho. A young couple had been ambushed in their home late at night. The husband was beaten unconscious, while the wife was forced to open the safe holding her wedding ring and family's savings. Though they survived, the psychological scars ran deep. "It stopped being about money a long time ago," Harrison told her team as new reports filtered in. "This was about fear and control. They weren't stealing to survive, they were stealing for the thrill of it." Watson's descent into rage. By the time Watson and Briggs reached Oregon, it was clear the crimes weren't random. Watson's unrepentant behavior during his interrogation offered chilling insight into his motivations. He wasn't just angry at the world, he felt entitled to take from it. "You think anyone gives a crap about guys like me?" Watson sneered when Harrison confronted him about the string of crimes. "Nobody gives a damn until we start taking back. Carter? He deserved everything he got. Hell, they all deserved it." Harrison could feel her blood boil during those exchanges, but she maintained her composure. Watson's cold depravity went beyond anger. This was driven by years of perceived betrayal, real or imagined. He didn't steal from his victims. He sought to ruin them. The final act, the Carters. All roads led back to the Carters. Years of simmering hatred found their tragic climax with a family of 4 who had done nothing but live peacefully in the suburbs. For Watson, it wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, it was revenge against a world he thought had left him behind. It was the kids, Harrison later admitted quietly to Walker during a late-night debrief. That's what I can't wrap my head around. No grudge could justify that. Walker shook his head solemnly. That's the thing about people like Watson, it's not about justifying. For him, it was about power. The kids weren't people to him, they were just something in his way. Briggs's tearful confession confirmed it. While Watson raged and destroyed, Briggs stood paralyzed, too afraid to intervene, too cowardly to leave. An unwavering mission for justice. Harrison sat in silence after the final pieces of the timeline were added to her ever-expanding evidence board. The crimes weren't isolated. They weren't spontaneous. Watson and Briggs were predators in every sense of the word, crawling across state lines and leaving only pain in their wake. These men, Harrison whispered ominously to herself, they didn't just ruin lives, they wrecked peace. They turned quiet homes into crime scenes. The case wasn't over yet. The trial loomed ahead, and with it the promise of justice. But in the heart of Laura Harrison the tragedy remained vivid. Every victim, every scar, every bloody footprint lingered in her mind. She vowed silently, there will be no escaping this, not for them, never again. The end of the horrors. With Mark Watson and Jared Briggs behind bars and their confessions signed, the wave of terror that had stretched across multiple states was officially over. Their capture marked the closing of a dark chapter, but for Detective Laura Harrison and the families affected by the trail of destruction, the journey toward justice was far from complete. There would be no celebration, no parade for the heroes chasing down monsters. What remained was the cold, unrelenting pursuit of accountability, a fight to make sure these men never harmed anyone again. The media frenzy. In the days following their arrests, the news cycles buzzed endlessly with updates about the case. Every talking head on television had a theory about how Watson and Briggs's crimes had escalated. Cable news splashed headlines like, Trail of Terror ends in Texas as killers apprehended, or, From burglars to butchers, the dark legacy of Mark Watson. Harrison watched a segment one night from her office, unable to avoid the flashing imagery of reporters standing outside the station. Their voices blurred together. Suspects now in custody. FBI confirms interstate connections. The Carter murders shocked America. Detective Laura Harrison led the team that finally brought their reign of terror to an end. She muted the screen, letting the silence fill the room. They act like it's a movie, she muttered to Walker, who dropped a fresh pile of reports on her desk. Like we weren't chasing after ghosts for weeks, like that family isn't still gone. Walker sat heavily in the chair across from her. You can't blame them, can you? People need closure. The media just packages it in a way that feels satisfying. They'll talk about it for 2 weeks, then move on. But we don't get to move on, she shot back, her eyes narrowing. The Carters are gone, the Mitchell woman is gone, all those families. They don't get closure, all they get is grief and court dates. Walker nodded solemnly. Then let's make the court dates count. The courtroom showdown. As the legal process began, it became clear that the trial would be a spectacle. Prosecutors were determined to build an ironclad case, compiling every piece of evidence with precision. The footprints, the pawnshop receipt, the white truck sightings, the confessions, all of it became part of a story that painted Watson and Briggs as predators who left devastation in their wake. They don't just deserve prison, the lead prosecutor told Harrison during their pre-trial briefings. They deserve to be remembered as monsters. No jury is going to let them walk after what they did. The trial itself was grueling. Family members of the Carters sat in the gallery, their faces etched with sorrow. Eleanor's sister Linda testified about the last time she'd spoken to her sister, just hours before the murders. She was so happy. They were just sitting down to dinner, Linda said through tears. And then they were gone. The prosecution saved the chilling confessions for the climax of their case. The jury squirmed uncomfortably as they watched video footage of Jared Briggs sobbing through his testimony, recounting how he stood by while Watson turned the Carter home into a slaughterhouse. I told him to stop, Briggs whimpered on the video. I told him, but he wouldn't. He said we couldn't leave witnesses. I didn't want to hurt the kids. God, I didn't. Then came Watson's taped interrogation. While Briggs's guilt was apparent, Watson's demeanor was ice cold. In the recording, he leaned back in his chair, smirking, as Harrison laid out the evidence against him. His voice filled the courtroom. They had it coming. Carter thought he was better than everyone else. I showed him he wasn't. They're all weak. Him, his family, everyone. Harrison glanced at the jury as they watched the footage. The disgust on their faces mirrored her own from the day she'd sat across from Watson, listening to his venom. Verdict and sentencing. The deliberation was short. The jury came back with a verdict after just 2 hours. Watson and Briggs were found guilty on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, multiple charges of burglary, and interstate conspiracy to commit violent crimes. For Watson, the sentence was absolute. Death penalty. Briggs, due to his cooperation in securing confessions and evidence, received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Carters' remaining family members released a statement to the press the same day, thanking law enforcement but acknowledging the deep, irreparable loss. No justice in this world will ever bring back Eleanor, William, Emily, or Noah, but we are grateful that those responsible for their deaths will never walk free again. Harrison read the statement aloud to her team in their office. The faces around her were solemn, but there was a shared sense of relief that their relentless work had paid off. The emotional toll weeks after the verdict, Harrison found herself driving past the Carter home for the first time since the investigation began. The house was empty now, the flower beds were overgrown, and the wind had toppled the swing set in the backyard. She parked across the street, sitting in silence as memories of the crime scene played in her head. Walker called her that night. "You okay?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought catching them would make it feel lighter. But it doesn't." "That's because catching them doesn't undo what happened," Walker said. "We did our jobs, Laura. We caught the monsters. That's all we can do." "I know," she replied quietly. I keep thinking about the kids. About how scared they must have been. About how it ended for them. How do you let that go?" Walker didn't answer right away, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Maybe you don't. Maybe that's the price we pay for doing this job." The legacy of grief and justice. In the months that followed, the case of Watson and Briggs became infamous. A story of unchecked rage, cowardice, and the painstaking work of law enforcement to bring the guilty to justice. HBO released a documentary, The Hunters, The Murders That Shocked America. Investigative journalists dissected every aspect of the case from the evidence to the interrogations. For the public it was a morbid fascination. For Harrison it was a reminder of the human cost. She kept a photo of the Carters on her desk, not for closure but as a symbol of why she continued the work. In the photo, William stood smiling with his arm around Eleanor. Emily held Noah's hand, their faces lit with the unguarded joy of childhood. It was an image that haunted her but also fueled her resolve. "These men ruined so many lives," she said in a quiet moment to her team, "but we made sure they'll never ruin another." And with that, the curtain fell on one of the darkest chapters Harrison had ever faced. Justice had been served, but in her heart, she knew there were always more shadows waiting, more monsters hiding in the world, and more battles yet to fight.